We're looking at the book of Samuel, which we've said is all about kingship. It provides a theology of kingship. Part of God's plan is to have a human king act as his representative and rule the world on his behalf, which leads us to questions if we're going to try to understand this plan. And one of the big questions we have is, what kind of king? We need a king. Judges made that clear, but what kind of king? And after identifying the kingmaker, the kind of person who is going to appoint the king, the next thing that God does is show us what kind of king he must not be. He gives us a bad example of the king because Israel asked for a king like the nations. That's the kind of king they thought they needed. And of course, I'm talking about Saul. Saul was popular. He was attractive. He went around with his spear. He was militarily successful, and yet he was not obedient. And so God rejects him as king. And having rejected Saul once and for all as king, in chapter 16, God comes to Samuel and tells him to anoint a new king in his place. Samuel is sad, but God asks him, "How long will you grieve over Saul, since I have rejected him from being king over Israel?" And he wants Samuel to stop grieving over his rejection of Saul, because Saul and this rejection is not the end of God's story. He's going to provide another king. And in chapter 16, we begin to see God go about providing this king. And honestly, actually, that word provide is key to understanding this chapter. It's translated in different ways in our English Bible, but we find this Hebrew word 9 times. The theme of this chapter is Yahweh's choice of a king. We need Yahweh to provide the proper king. If we try to identify the proper king for ourselves, we're going to fail. We're going to pick Saul. We need Yahweh to provide the proper king. And the first verse of 1 Samuel 16 shows us that even in man's failure, there is hope in God's faithfulness. So Samuel is sad about Saul, and in a sense, that of course is a beautiful thing that people chose a king over Samuel, and yet Samuel loved this man and wanted his best. And when he rebelled against God, it hurt Samuel deeply. And yet, even in man's rebellion, God has not lost the ability to keep his promise. And so God comes to Samuel and tells him he has a plan to anoint a king in Saul's place, and he needs to go to Bethlehem to do so. That's important. Bethlehem is going to come up a lot more in our Bibles. Even though God has a plan, Samuel faces some really genuine fears. In particular, he's afraid that Saul's going to kill him. God gives him a plan for dealing with that problem. He would go to offer a sacrifice, and when Samuel comes to Bethlehem, the elders of the city come out to meet him trembling. That's what the text says. What were they scared of? I'm not sure, but I would guess they'd heard of Samuel hacking King Agag to pieces, and that would make him something of a frightening figure, besides the fact that he spoke for God. But whatever reason they were frightened, Samuel calms their fears by telling them of his plan to offer God a sacrifice. Up to this point, God has only told Samuel that he would choose one of Jesse's sons. He's not told him specifically which son. But when Samuel meets Jesse's boys, he thinks he instinctively knows who it must be. It must be Eliab. God knows, of course, the mistake that Samuel was making, which was kind of the same mistake Israel had made, actually. And so he gives him instructions. What are the instructions he gives? In verse 7, he says, "Do not look on his appearance or on the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For the Lord sees not as man sees. Man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart." And that's really important. Mark it down, bold print. Some would call that the key verse of 1 Samuel. It looks back and it shows us the problem with Saul, and it actually also looks forward and shows us the problem with Absalom. It's about the heart. God is looking at the heart. What kind of king do we need? Don't get so focused on the externals. What God's interested in is his heart. And that should spark our interest, of course, because we're learning this theology of kingship, and we're seeing that God's concerned about the heart. But what can we learn from the one God chooses about what God's looking for in the heart? As we look at David, we should be contrasting him with Saul to say, what is the difference? Now, that's not quite as easy as it sounds because there are some similarities, but one big difference is the fact that physically, David wasn't as obviously kingly as Saul, at least not at this point. You remember the description of Saul as being taller than everyone, and David wasn't quite as distinctive. In fact, Jesse's sons pass in front of Samuel, and repeatedly Samuel has to say, the Lord hasn't chosen you, the Lord hasn't chosen you, the Lord hasn't chosen you. And through this process, God is making it clear that the man Samuel anoints is the man he himself has chosen. Surprisingly, it takes some work even for Samuel to discover that Jesse has a son named David. After God had told Samuel he would provide a king from Jesse's son, Samuel must have been surprised to see all these different sons pass by and hear the Lord say he hasn't chosen this one. And yet still he trusts God's word, and so he has to ask Jesse, are all your sons here? And this reminds us just how differently God looks on things than people do, because even here, David's own father didn't expect that he would be the one chosen by God to be king. But he was exactly the one that God had in mind. After Samuel anoints David, the text says, the Spirit of the Lord rushed on him from that day forward. And that's really a pivotal statement, because in the very next verse we read, now the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul. And what we're going to see in these passages is a stark contrast between Saul and David beginning to develop. The one God rejected and the one God anointed. And one of the key differences here is that the Spirit of the Lord has rushed on David. And really, throughout the Old Testament, what we've seen about the Spirit of the Lord, we've seen him coming upon a person, but what it says here about his relationship to David is actually a little bit unusual. It says the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon David from that day forward. Usually what we've seen is the Spirit of the Lord coming upon a person to help him, enable him to accomplish a specific purpose during a specific period of time. But here we see the pictures of the Spirit of the Lord continuing on with David. After David is anointed by Samuel, Samuel leaves, and we really don't hear much more of Samuel until he dies. And the reason for that, of course, is because he's done his job. What does a kingmaker do? He appoints the king, and now he's appointed the real king. And one of the ways we know he's the real king is because the Spirit of the Lord is on him and dwells in him. And of course, as we think about Jesus, our true king, we think of John the Baptist. John the Baptist's role was to point to Jesus. Once the Spirit came upon Jesus, John the Baptist fades into the background like Samuel. Samuel's primary role was to point towards David. Once the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon David, Samuel had fulfilled his task. But now that David has been anointed, the question is, how does a young boy go from the middle of nowhere, tending sheep, to ruling over Israel as king? Watch what God can do. It starts with a harmful spirit from God tormenting Saul. 1 Samuel chapter 16, verse 14 puts it like this. Now the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul, and a harmful spirit from the Lord tormented him. Obviously, this is an act of judgment on God's part, but at the same time, it's part of God's great plan. He's able to use harmful spirits. The servants of Saul recognize what's happening, and they come up with a solution. They tell Saul, look for a man who's skillful in playing a musical instrument, who can play for you when you're being tormented by this harmful spirit. Somehow, one of Saul's servants knew David and recommended him, and one of the key lines in his recommendation was that the Lord was with David. Ding, ding, ding. What does a true king look like? Well, it's about the heart. We're going to recognize the true king by his relationship with the Spirit, and the Lord is with him. That's key. Saul agrees with this recommendation and chooses David. And the text actually says in verse 21, and Saul loved him greatly, and he became his armor bearer. Now what's happening here? First, we see that God has chosen David, and now we see Saul choosing David. Before Saul becomes consumed with sinful jealousy towards David, and we're going to see it gets ugly, even he is struck by David's godly character. And we might wonder about David's character from the way Saul reacts to him throughout the rest of this book. But we see here the problem isn't actually with David. The problem's with Saul. Before Saul was worried about David taking over the kingship, he was impressed by David. And we're going to see the things that made David especially great and that point forward to Christ as the story of David's rise begins in earnest in chapter 17. After serving Saul for a time, David returns to his father and to his sheep in chapter 17. And the Philistines have gathered together to war against Israel. The army of Israel and the army of the Philistines face each other in the valley of Elah. And on the one side of the valley, the Philistines have encamped, and on the other side, the Israelites. And one of the Philistines comes out from the middle of their army, a giant named Goliath. And he begins taunting Israel and really taunting their God. Who does he say that he's defying in verse 10? The Philistine said, I defy the ranks of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together. But remember, Israel is God's people, and David knows that. So listen to who David says Goliath really is defying. Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? If we were to ask the writer of this story and ask David what the problem was, what the issue was, this was a man who was dishonoring God. This was a man who was challenging God's faithfulness to his promises. This is just another man in this long line of the seed of Satan coming up to wage war against the seed of the woman. And the people of Israel were believing him and not God's promises. And to set the stage, the author gives us a description of Goliath in verses 4 through 7. And from a certain perspective, this is definitely an imposing figure. He was almost 3 meters tall. He wore about 57 kilograms of armor. He was carrying a spear that had an iron head weighing 7 kilograms. And he was able to cause an entire army to be afraid. When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. And yet, on the other hand, who is this Philistine in comparison with God, really? We've already seen in 1 Samuel 16:7 that God tells us not to look on a person's appearance or the height of his stature because he does not see as we see. It's so tempting for us to judge everything by appearances. And as we look at David in this chapter, we're going to see he's the one man in Israel who's not judging things by their appearances, but instead is evaluating things in terms of faith. While this Philistine had been taunting Israel for a period of 40 days, David doesn't know what's happening because he's with his father tending sheep. And Jesse decides that David should bring his brothers some food. And the story tells us that David came and he greeted his brothers and he talked with them. And in the middle of doing that, behold, look, the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, came up out of the ranks of the Philistines and spoke the same words as before, and David heard him. Over and over, we've been seeing how Israel responds to its problems when it forgets God. In case we've forgotten, the writer reminds us in verse 24, all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him and were much afraid. But how does bringing God into the perspective change the way one looks at what's happening? Listen to the very first words we hear from David in the book of Samuel. For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? We can see that people who stop trusting God often become angry when someone brings this kind of God-centered perspective into the equation. They're interpreting their circumstances apart from God. David sees this, he says, no, this is what's really happening, because he's looking at things and interpreting what's happening through faith in God. And they become angry at him when he does. David's oldest brother is furious that David would even question Goliath. Verse 28, now Eliab, his oldest brother, heard when he spoke to the men, and Eliab's anger was kindled against David. And he said, why have you come down? And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your presumption and the evil of your heart, for you've come down to see the battle. And David said, what have I done now? Was it not but a word? At this point, people hear what David's saying, and they bring him to Saul. And this is a key text because we're going to see where David's courage came from. And again, we're seeing what makes the true king. But what does David say to Saul in verse 32? And how does Saul respond? Let no man's heart fail because of him. This is David. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine. And Saul said to David, you're not able to go against this Philistine to fight him, for you're but a youth. And he has been a man of war from his youth. And what are David's answers? This is to Saul's objections. This is giving you insight into his heart. He talks about his past victories over lions and bears. And Yet ultimately, he's finding his hope in God. That's what's key. Your servant has struck down both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, for he has defied the armies of the living God. And David said, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. It's God. God will keep his promise. And we often blame our fear and our lack of courage on our circumstances, when the reality is our fear and lack of courage comes from a failure to remember how faithful God's been to his promises, and a failure to believe that God will be faithful to those promises in the future. David was courageous, not because David was so special. This chapter really is working hard to make that clear. David is courageous because he has faith in God. And he has every reason to have faith. This is the God who rescued Israel from Egypt, after all. Now, we know how the rest of the story goes, but let's just quickly see what we can learn from it. One problem we have is we think David's the hero of the story, and we mess everything up as a result. The author's trying to do everything he can to get your eyes off David. After all, what did David's brother say to him? Who are you? You're just tending a few sheep. What did Saul say about David? You're a youth. You can't do this. What does Goliath say about him? He says, am I a dog? Seriously? This is the one that you're sending, that you come at me with sticks? But finally, David speaks, and as he speaks, we learn what this chapter is all about. David said to the Philistine, verse 45, you come to me with a sword, a spear, and a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of armies, the armies of Israel, whom you have taunted. This day the Lord will deliver you up into my hands, and I will strike you down and remove your head from you, and I will give the dead bodies of the army of the Philistine this day to the birds of the sky and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. David had been reading the book of Exodus, hadn't he? Sounds so much like Moses in Exodus. And that all this assembly may know that the Lord does not deliver by sword or by spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. One of the interesting things about the book of Samuel is that when you see Saul, he has a sword or a spear. When you see David, he never has a sword or a spear. And one of the reasons it does that is because it's trying to give you an image of what a true king should look like. You know how when you see someone with a stethoscope and a white lab coat, you think of them as a scientist or a doctor. That is sort of the symbol for them. What is the symbol for a true king? We think spear, but no, it's not for God's kind of king. He's not trusting in his own might. What is the symbol when we think of David in the book of Samuel that accompanies him? It's a harp. He's singing praises. And David here says, look, this is not about me. This is about the glory of God. And this is about God's faithfulness to his promises and God's ability to keep his promises. In fact, if this story is about David at all, it's about his inadequacy, his weakness. The focus in this chapter is on God's adequacy in the middle of David's weakness. And yet at the same time, we can learn from David. We saw in chapter 16 that God looks on the heart and that he's chosen David because of what was in his heart. What was in David's heart in this chapter? Trust in God, zeal for God's glory. That's the kind of king that we need. That's the kind of king that God's going to send.